Let's rewind the clock to 1920. That's when the U.S. decided to embark on one of its boldest social experiments, Prohibition. The 18th Amendment made it illegal to produce, sell, or transport alcohol across the country. The whole idea behind Prohibition was driven by the temperance movement, which had been picking up steam in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Advocates believed that alcohol was the root of many social evils, including poverty, crime, and domestic violence. By banning it, they hoped to create a more moral and orderly society. But, as history has shown us, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Southern Blueprint Podcast. I am Matt Swift, and today we're diving deep into the spirited journey through one of America's most rebellious and downright fascinating eras, Prohibition. So, grab a glass of your finest spirit, and let's get started. All right, first things first, let's have a drink. Today, I've got some Old Forester 1920 Prohibition-style bourbon. I thought that this was very fitting for today's episode. Old Forester has a pretty cool backstory. During Prohibition, there were 6 distillers in Kentucky, including Old Forester, that were allowed to keep producing whiskey for quote-unquote medicinal purposes. That's right. If you had a doctor's note, you could get yourself a little bit of medicine. Old Forester has kept the spirit of the 20s alive, and this particular bottle is a nod to that era. This Prohibition style, it's coming in at 115 proof, and is also a bourbon continuously sold by the same company that was available for sale before, during, and after Prohibition. Old Forester was founded back in 1870 by George Garvin Brown. It was also the first bourbon sold in sealed bottles to ensure quality and consistency. Medicinal whiskey was kind of a common loophole during the Prohibition era. Many people found that a prescription for medicinal whiskey was quite easy to obtain. In fact, during the 13 years of Prohibition, it's estimated that Americans consumed 1.5 million barrels of quote-unquote legal medicinal whiskey. But let me tell you a little bit about how this bourbon smells and tastes. The aroma on this kind of gives me like a burnt brown sugar, caramel, and dark chocolate, and some oak. A lot of your typical bourbon notes. But as we taste it, cheers, guys. We kind of get that immediate like peppery bite, but I think that kind of like balances out the sweetness. I'm getting some nuttiness and coriander, toasty, like smoke flavor, and a tad bit of banana. And I don't know why every time I have this, I get that. I don't really care for it, but overall, it's a damn good bourbon. The finish is long and warming. There's those hints of that like dark chocolate again, and that smokiness. At 115 proof, it's got a pretty good, strong kick to it, but it's remarkably smooth for its strength. What I love about Old Forester 1920 is that it's not just a bourbon. It's kind of a piece of history in a glass. It's a spirit that kind of reminds us of that time period and a nod to those who found ways to keep their traditions alive, even in the face of government opposition and a ban. And sometimes, you've got to get creative and adapt or stretch the rules, or maybe, just maybe, have some friends in high places. Let's talk about the Prohibition era. The American public was simply not ready to give up their liquor. Almost immediately after Prohibition was enacted, a black market for alcohol emerged. This black market, of course, was supplied by bootleggers, those who illegally manufactured and transported and sold moonshine. Moonshine gets its name because it was often made and distributed at night under the light of the moon and to avoid detection by authorities. Moonshine became a staple during the early 1900s. It's an unaged, high-proof spirit, typically made from corn mash. Moonshine is clear because it's not aged and stored in barrels. The barrels, if you didn't know, is what actually gives whiskey its kind of brown color and also helps it take on other flavor profiles, like I was telling you about with Old Forester. Moonshine was produced in homemade stills, often hidden deep in the woods to avoid detection by law enforcement. The secrecy of these operations was absolutely paramount, as federal agents, often referred to as revenuers, were constantly on the hunt for illegal alcohol production. North Carolina, in particular, was a hotbed for bootlegging activities. The state's geography played a critical role. Its dense forests, mountainous terrain, and remote locations provided the perfect cover for moonshiners to set up their operations. The tradition of homemade liquor was already well established in the Appalachia region long before Prohibition, so it was no surprise that when the ban took effect, the operations in that area merely expanded and became even more clandestine. Western North Carolina was dotted with small family-run operations. These operations were often passed down through generations, with each family guarding the recipes and techniques. There was a great pride in making good moonshine. During Prohibition, though, there were some bootleggers and everyday citizens who were making bathtub gin and rot gut whiskey. Sadly, there were people that were so desperate for a drink, they would consume any alcohol that they could find, no matter how foul it might be. Many of these low quality products contain industrial grade alcohol and other toxic chemicals, and that may have killed upwards to 10,000 people prior to the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. But most moonshiners really took the time and effort to make a quality product. It was certainly a sense of pride, and you were carrying on a family tradition and carrying on a family recipe, and also it was probably a little bit of bragging rights. However, as I mentioned, corn was typically the primary ingredient in moonshine, and it was readily available and well suited to the distillation process. One of the reasons moonshine became so prevalent in North Carolina was really just basic economic necessity. Moonshining provided a critical source of income for many families who were struggling to make ends meet through traditional farming, making the risk of any type of legal consequences and even possible jail time worth it for many. Moonshine wasn't just consumed locally, it was also transported to larger cities where the demand for illegal alcohol was booming. In North Carolina, largely because of the railroad system, because of textiles, moonshiners used these routes for major transportation to urban centers up in the north and out in the Midwest. Outside of the railways, bootleggers would often transport the liquor in modified vehicles, which were designed to outrun law enforcement. Drivers had to also navigate dangerous terrains at high speeds to avoid capture. These modifications to the cars, trying to get the most out of their engines, increasing the speed, are what eventually led to the foundation of NASCAR, which we will get into a little more later when we talk about the famous moonshiner, Junior Johnson. But moonshiners were known for their creativity. They developed a variety of techniques to evade detection. They would build stills hidden deep in the woods. They would build them in caves. They would use lookouts to warn for approaching law enforcement. Some moonshiners went to great lengths to protect their operations. They would set up traps and build false trails to throw off revenuers. And then they would just straight up bribe local officials. But let's face it, even some law enforcement probably had stills themselves. It was just a way of life back then. And despite all the risk, moonshining was seen by many as just a matter of pride, like I've mentioned a couple times. But it was a way to assert independence and resist government interference in their lives. This defiant spirit was passed down through generations and created this culture that celebrated the moonshiner as a folk hero. But moonshiners weren't just in it for profit. For many, it was about survival. The Great Depression hit rural areas like Appalachia pretty hard, and moonshining became a way for families to make ends meet. The alcohol produced wasn't just sold locally, like I mentioned. It was often transported to major cities. Moonshine was also used as a sort of currency, and thus why the federal government wanted to get their hands on it. The government had tried this before, which led to the Whiskey Rebellion of the 1790s. Alexander Hamilton, who I'm not a fan of, it's a great play. I love the play, but I'm not a fan of his. But he had a key role in trying to tax spirits in order to raise money for the government. He also thought everyday citizens were too stupid to govern themselves, but that's a whole different story for another time. But regardless, the taxation on alcohol did not go over well, and it led to the Whiskey Rebellion. Fast forward now 129 years, and here we are again trying to tax alcohol again. And again, people saw this as an overreach, which fueled resentment and rebellion. And it also led to some unforeseen consequences, primarily adding and supporting organized crime. During Prohibition, there was such a high demand for moonshine in places like Chicago, where you had Al Capone, and New York, where you had, Lucky Luciano, that Southern moonshiners were shipping booze there, and it was helping fuel organized crime, which is ironic considering why this ban was put in place. You look at South Carolina, Hellhole Swamp in Berkeley County. It became the national leader in moonshine production. And a couple years back, a team of archaeologists, they unearthed remains of a liquor still that they believe belonged to Benjamin Villepontis. And together, he and Al Capone ran moonshine out of South Carolina up to Chicago. And then you look at Alabama, who they actually enacted Prohibition back in 1907, well before the national ban. But there it was just basically open rebellion, tons of clashes, and it was just pure chaos. And it led to more crime and more killing. KKK was actually helping to try to enforce Prohibition at the time. And again, it just kind of shows you that this ban had the opposite effect. I look at New Orleans. They were also a big hub for bootlegging and moonshining. A lot of foreign liquor also, too, was smuggled into the city by, they call them rum runners. The Mississippi River was a perfect way to bring illegal spirits in and out of New Orleans. Traditional saloons were then replaced by quote unquote soft drink stands, which sold this kind of like home brew to poor customers. And New Orleans had more padlocked speakeasies. And a speakeasy is a kind of an undercover place where you can go and drink and not be seen by folks. But they had more speakeasies than any other city in the entire nation in 1927. It's funny, some of the members of the New Orleans City Council sought to have alcohol declared a food supplement to try to circumvent the law. And then, we got to talk about Tennessee. When we talk about moonshine, Tennessee was both the first state to adopt prohibition laws and one of the earliest birthplaces of moonshine production, which I think is funny. But longtime companies like Jack Daniels and George Dickel, they actually had to relocate their production companies at the time out of state, or they were going to face criminal charges. And I don't think it was only men who were bootlegging and making moonshine. For example, Molly Miller, she led the Moonshiners of Polk County, and she was credited for killing several revenuers and informants. So again, this law is enacted to try to help society better itself, and it really just had the opposite effect. There was just a lot of greed and criminality at the time. There was just so much money to be made. Folks were struggling. It was the Great Depression. So there is no doubt as to why that led to widespread corruption. And no better place that represented this was the quote-unquote moonshine capital of the world, which was Franklin County, Virginia. We've talked about North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, but we haven't mentioned Virginia yet. But apparently Franklin County was the moonshine capital of the world. It is said that more sugar was delivered to Boone's Mill, Virginia, which is in Franklin County, but more sugar was delivered there during Prohibition than New York City. Of course, sugar is a key ingredient for making hooch, and to be sneaky about it, sugar was bought up by legitimate businesses like bakeries as a cover for its real intention. Indeed, a good portion of Franklin County's population was involved with moonshine, even if they weren't distilling it and distributing it themselves. And I'm sure there were some honest law enforcement agents in Franklin County, but most were not. And even the local sheriff realized that they could make a profit from the moonshine trade by imitating the practices that were set up in these big cities. So they started making moonshiners leave bribes. It was known as a granny fee. And what this would do is moonshiners would have these bribes that they would pay to law enforcement to prevent the law enforcement from smashing up their stills. They had to pay $25 per still and $10 per whiskey load. And as these fees increase, a lot of the small-time moonshiners were forced out of business, and the illegal industry was kind of consolidated. And again, it was kind of based on who law enforcement wanted to go after, who they were involved with, who they were partnering with, and who was bribing them. By the 1930s, folks were so intertwined with moonshine that the national spotlight came to rest on Franklin County. They were just drawing way too much attention. The federal government suggested that it had been defrauded $5.5 million in excess whiskey taxes. And to put that in perspective, that's $95 million in today's money. And thus, this brought forth the Great Moonshine Conspiracy Trial of 1935. It was a lengthy trial in terms of both duration and defendants. It lasted 10 weeks, and it was the second longest trial in Virginia history, right behind the Aaron Burr trial in 1807. The alleged conspiracy was uncovered by federal agent Colonel Thomas Bailey. He was a World War I hero, but he became an undercover agent for the federal government. He started posing as a small-scale moonshine buyer, and he went undercover in Franklin County, and this kind of all began in 1934. Unlike previous attempts to curtail illegal liquor production, Bailey's plan sought to kind of protect, small distillers in exchange for incriminating information that could lead to the arrest of the conspiracy's, ringleaders. After roughly a year, Bailey was allegedly able to uncover a complex, system driven by bribery and extortion. With all of this, the trial ended up indicting 80 people that were involved in the illegal production and distribution of moonshine whiskey in Virginia. It's unreal. And again, it just kind of goes to show you at what lengths people were going to make a living and to just really get in on the action one way or another. I'll tell you what, let's take a break here because I am thirsty. Before we dive into some stories of some notorious moonshiners and bootleggers, I want to take a moment to appreciate another spirit that pays homage to this era, and that is Southern Distilling Company's Hunting Creek, which is their straight rye whiskey. And I want to tell you a little bit about it. So Southern Distilling Company is located in Statesville, North Carolina, which is right up the road from me, actually. So the cool thing about this, Old Hunting Creek is an old label from the 1800s. Actually, J.C. Somers and Samuel Lee Tays opened J.C. Somers and Company in 1885 in Asheville, North Carolina. So this is an old label from Asheville. It was very popular at the time, but this is an abandoned label. But Southern Distilling Company, they saw this old label. They've taken it, they've repurposed it. It's still called Old Hunting Creek. It's a delicious straight rye whiskey. I'm going to have a little bit, tell you a little bit about it, but I thought it was just very, very fitting for this episode. So as we smell this, I get a hint of blackberry, vanilla, cornbread, which I really, really love. And then there's a little bit of like cinnamon there too. As we kind of taste this, you get some roasted peanuts, you got honey, you got clove, you got a little bit of spice to it. It kind of tastes a little bit like cinnamon roll. I'm a big bourbon drinker, getting into more ryes, but I got to tell you, one, Southern Distilling Company makes great things, but two, this Old Hunting Creek rye whiskey is absolutely fantastic. I did if you don't follow me on social media, I do this thing called Swift Sips where I review bourbons and ryes, and this is one that I've already reviewed. So if you get a chance, you should pick up a bottle. It's fantastic. But again, I thought it was very, very fitting, an old label from the 1800s, early 1900s that's been revitalized. And it's a really cool story, but also a really, really good rye. But let's get back to the story. Now that we've wet our whistle, let's talk about some legendary moonshiners and bootleggers who became folk heroes in their own right. I'm going to begin with Amos Owens, one of the earliest and most famous moonshiners in North Carolina. Known as the Cherry Bounce King, he was born in 1822 in Rutherford County, North Carolina. Owens became famous for his homemade cherry-flavored whiskey known as Cherry Bounce. He fought in the Civil War for the Confederates. He initially fought in the Battle of Bull Run, and then he later served in the 56th North Carolina Regiment. Owens' service was marked by hardship. He spent time in Union stockades, and he returned home, let's say, ill and bitter towards the North. Owens vowed never to pay federal taxes on distilled spirits. This vow of defiance became a cornerstone of Owens's identity as a moonshiner and a symbol of his broader resistance to federal control. His Cherry Bounce wasn't just a drink; it was a tradition in the Owens family. The recipe had been passed down through generations, and it became a local favorite. Owens set up his still on Cherry Mountain, and from there he began producing Cherry Bounce in large quantities. His operation was so successful that it called the attention of local law enforcement, and eventually the federal government came calling. He often used a telescope to try to spot revenue agents before they reached his still. And he was also known for his audacious behavior even when he was caught. Owens was arrested multiple times, but he always returned to his still after serving time. At one point, he was locked up for a whole entire year. As legend has it, when revenuers approached his house to take him in at one point, he offered them breakfast, which they refused, but then he offered them some cherry bounce. Obliging, the agents consumed their fill and became pissed drunk and passed out. But rather than run, Owens waited until the revenue men sobered up enough, and they ended up taking him in, and that's when he served 6 months of jail time. But despite the risk of jail time, Owens continued to distill cherry bounce, and every summer he hosted a lively, gathering at Cherry Mountain to celebrate the cherry harvest. And he did not stop making moonshine until he was sent to prison in his 70s. His story is emblematic of the moonshiners of the time. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a community figure. He shared his cherry bounce with friends and neighbors, and his boldness in the face of the law made him a local hero. Although Owens died in 1906, his legacy lived on long after his death, with cherry bounce becoming a symbol of resistance and local pride in North Carolina. Today, there is still a cherry bounce festival in Forest City in his honor, which is in June of every single year. Now let's talk about Maggie Bailey. Maggie began making moonshine at the age of 17, and it became her life's work. She lived in Harlan County, Kentucky, and the people in the community absolutely loved her. She would help anyone who had fallen on hard times and even help send some local kids to college. Maggie looked like any typical grandmother. She wore a house dress and apron every single day, but funny enough, Maggie never drank herself, but continued to sell moonshine well into her 90s. She said she started selling moonshine to help her family make ends meet. And if you were in the market for a batch of moonshine, all you had to do was pull around the back of her house and she'd load up your truck with all you wanted. But Maggie had a rule. She never sold to children, and she never sold it to people who she considered drunkards. She was a very smart woman. And she educated herself on the Fourth Amendment. She knew all about search and seizures and could quote certain cases back and forward. There was a lot of times where law enforcement would try to come to her house with a warrant, but she had so many different buildings on the property that the warrants didn't include certain buildings, so they couldn't search that. So she was able to get out of a lot of situations that way, but also she just had a really great personality and was able to get out of things because people didn't want to convict her. She was only imprisoned one time where she spent 2 years for selling moonshine. That time she got convicted with 150 half gallons worth of moonshine. The only other time other than like the 40s, in the 1960s, she found herself kind of dealing with the federal authorities again. This time, police claimed to have found hundreds of thousands of dollars in a Foot Locker at her home. But she was able to get out of it, and that's the thing. She managed to get out of things over and over and over again. There was one time when she had 6 acquittals at 3 different courts on the same day. It just seems like no one just wanted to convict this lady. And that's kind of the thing. Like, she was just so well loved and did a lot in the community. People didn't want her to get in trouble. She ended up dying at the age of 101 back in 2005 of complications from pneumonia. Maggie, like a lot of moonshiners during that time, even though most did serve jail time, they were so well beloved by their communities and even law enforcement that it kept them out of trouble most of the time. And that kind of goes back to the whole folk hero thing. Maggie, like Amos Owens, they were very generous with the money they made, and they used, moonshining money to help their communities. We talked about corruption and crime, and sure, there was a lot of that, but there were also folks out there just trying to make a living. And even though moonshining was illegal, they weren't involved in any other nefarious activities. Let's now talk about Junior Johnson. I mean, we have to talk about him, right? He's arguably one of the most famous moonshiners of all time. Born in 1931 in Wilkes County, North Carolina, Junior came from a long line of moonshiners. His family had been making whiskey since the 1700s, and by the time Junior was a teenager, he was already deeply involved in the family business. What set Junior Johnson apart from everyone else, of course, was his talent behind the wheel. That's what he was known for. The back roads of North Carolina were dangerous, but, Johnson knew them like the back of his hand. He became known for his ability to outrun the law using his knowledge of the local terrain, but also he was a really good mechanic and could milk every ounce of speed out of the Fords and the Oldsmobiles that he was using in these whiskey runs. He would modify the engines and to produce more horsepower. He would add heavy-duty suspension to carry the extra weight of the booze. A lot of moonshiners during that time would build steel plates in the front of the engines in case the law enforcement would try to shoot the engine out. So again, moonshiners were very creative, and it just kind of goes back to just how they were able to modify these cars in a way to outrun and just outsmart the law. But Johnson's driving skills were very, very impressive, and of course that eventually led him to a career in stock car racing, and eventually became a legend in the early days of NASCAR. But Junior was also a very good master distiller. He was known for producing some of the highest quality moonshine in the region, and he was selling this, outside of North Carolina, and his product was so sought after, he actually became one of the most successful moonshiners in American history. His transition from a moonshiner to a NASCAR legend is very, very interesting to me. And it kind of encapsulates the spirit of resilience and being able to reinvent yourself. And that kind of defined the Prohibition era and years past that, even after the repeal. While, Johnson most of the time was able to get away, his family were raided once, and they got, I think it was 7,000 gallons of moonshine, making it one of the largest raids in U.S. history. And the troubles with the cops didn't stop there. Eventually, he was caught firing up a still, and he did 11 months of jail time for that. In the 1950s, after serving a brief prison sentence for his moonshining activities, Junior Johnson decided to go legitimate. So, NASCAR was founded on February 21st, 1948. And Junior, like we were saying, became one of the most successful drivers in NASCAR history, winning 50 races and earning eventually a place in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. But after his racing career took off, the shadow of moonshining never fully disappeared. But Johnson remained a folk hero, and he was celebrated for both of his racing achievements and his defiance of the law in the same tradition. In 2007, decades after his moonshining days were over, Johnson even lent his name to a legal brand of moonshine, bringing his story full circle. His legacy is a powerful reminder of how closely intertwined the world of stock car racing is with the history of bootlegging in America. Oh, and I almost forgot. Here's another funny, interesting tidbit. On December 26, 1985, Junior Johnson received a full unconditional pardon from President Ronald Reagan for Junior Johnson's 1956 conviction, which I think is hilarious. Junior Johnson passed away back in 2019 at the age of 88, going down as a legend. And speaking of legends, we have to wrap up with one of the all-time greats, Popcorn Sutton. If you picture what a moonshiner looks like, if you were to look it up in the dictionary and there would be a photo there, it's of Popcorn Sutton, who is perhaps the most colorful character in all of moonshining history. He got his name Popcorn from when he was younger. He went to go get popcorn out of a vending machine, and it took his money. He then grabbed a pool cue and destroyed the vending machine, and thus got his name, Popcorn. But he was born Marvin Sutton in 1946 in Maggie Valley, North Carolina. Popcorn was a true Appalachian moonshiner and in every sense of the word. He learned the trade from his father and grandfather and quickly developed a really great reputation for producing some of the finest moonshine in the region. He was fiercely proud of his craft. And we've talked about pride a couple of times now on the show, but he was the type of guy that was deeply committed to traditional methods of production. He used copper stills, he used pure mountain water, and a recipe that had been in his family for generations. His troubles started in the 70s and in the 80s. His first arrest and conviction was in 1974 on charges of course, selling untaxed liquor. He was then arrested again in 1981 and then in 1985 on charges of possessing a controlled substance, and also there was an assault charge, and that charge got him some time in Asheville's Craggy Correctional Center. But throughout all this time, Popcorn operated a kind of this like small, I guess, junk shop just outside of Cherokee, North Carolina. And it was like a true, junk shop filled with things like old license plates, used appliances, old bottles. And also for a time, he covertly sold his homebrew moonshine out of the shop. Unfortunately, someone snitched on his covert alcohol operation, and in 1998, state agents searched his place, and they seized over 60 gallons of moonshine. So, while operating a distilling unit and selling illegal alcohol is a felony punishable up to 5 years in prison and also a fine up to $10,000, Popcorn was not initially sent to jail for this. The judge instead put him on probation and offered him an out with a suspended sentence. He was of course not allowed to produce moonshine, but he kind of gets off pretty light here. But this is where Popcorn went from a relatively unknown small-time moonshiner into something of a national celebrity and local legend. Rather than lay low and following the sentence, Popcorn saw fit to share his world with the rest of the world. He worked with a local author to write a semi-autobiography and kind of like this insider guide to moonshine production. In 1999, the book was finished, and it was I think it was self-published under the title Me and My Liquor, and liquor is spelled L-I-K-K-E-R. And despite him initially only selling the book out of his junk shop, it received quite a lot of attention. Popcorn also created a home video under the same name and title, basically showing his shop, showing his whole operation and how to make moonshine. And then after that, filmmaker Neil Hutchinson got word of all of this, and he ends up making, I think there was 2 documentaries. One I know is called Mountain Talk. But it just, I think he ends up making 2 films about it. But it just kind of brings national attention to Popcorn and what he's doing, and he's not supposed to be producing moonshine, and he 100% is. And then also too, there's a really great interview. If you really want to know what popcorn is about, there is a really, really great interview with Johnny Knoxville. Johnny Knoxville has his own podcast. It's called Pretty Sure I Can Fly. And he interviews and he talks about Popcorn Sutton in this episode. And it's really, really good stuff. Popcorn is, like I said, he's very colorful, tells some cringy jokes. It's not for the faint of heart, but and it's pretty funny. But so if you get a chance, I would go listen to this. I think it's episode 13 of Pretty Sure I Can Fly, which is Johnny Knoxville's podcast. But it's really, really good. Unfortunately, Sutton's fame also brought, like I said, all this scrutiny from law enforcement. In 2007, he was arrested for producing alcohol, and he, yet again, after he wrote a book and made a home video, and then there was 2 documentaries made about him. But he was caught yet again, and he was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, and facing the prospect of spending his final years behind bars. Popcorn was in kind of poor health. He chose to end his own life in 2009. And that interview with Johnny Knoxville, I think, was just a few months before Popcorn committed suicide. But like I said, it's really good stuff. If you get a chance, go listen to that. Go get the book, watch the documentaries. I haven't seen the documentaries. I've ordered the book. But I want to see the documentaries. But Popcorn's death kind of marked an end of an era. But his legacy, has certainly lived on. Most people know about Popcorn Sutton. He's kind of like this symbol of independence and resistance. And, again, when you think about a moonshiner, like, this is the guy you pretty much think about. But today, Popcorn Sutton's name lives on through a legal brand of moonshine that bears his likeness. It's kind of ironic and bittersweet in a way. It's a tribute to a man who dedicated his life to an illegal craft, yet he now has a legal brand of moonshine. But his story is kind of like this reminder of the complex relationship between tradition, law, commerce, taxes, defiance, and again, just kind of sums up the whole moonshining experience. The story of moonshiners and bootleggers is not complete without discussing the end of Prohibition. I know we've jumped around a little bit, especially with like Junior Johnson and Popcorn Sutton, in the 50s and then the 70s, 80s, 90s and on. But we got to go back to the repeal of Prohibition. By the early 1930s, it had become clear that Prohibition was a failure. Instead of curbing alcohol consumption, the 18th Amendment had fueled the rise of organized crime, widespread corruption, and a thriving black market for liquor. Speakeasies and secret bars popped up all across the country, like we've talked about, and it was often operated by powerful mobsters, like Al Capone. The public's frustration with Prohibition grew as the Great Depression worsened. Many Americans begin to see the law not as a moral imperative, but as a unnecessary restriction that was causing more harm than good. The government, too, recognized that tax revenue from legal alcohol sales could provide much needed funds during the economic crisis. Moreover, the enforcement of Prohibition was costly and ineffective. Federal agents were often outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and even killed by bootleggers and moonshiners. On December 5th, 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment and effectively ending Prohibition. It was a moment of a celebration for many, but also one of transition for the bootleggers and moonshiners who built their lives around the illegal liquor trade. The repeal of Prohibition marked the end of an era. Some of them, like a Junior Johnson, found new ways to apply skills in, legal industries. Others, however, continued their operation in secret, unwilling to give up their craft or profits that it brought. The repeal of Prohibition also had significant cultural impacts. It marked the beginning of the modern liquor industry as we know it today, with many of the brands and distilleries that had survived by producing, we talked about medicinal whiskey or even operating overseas, were now returning back to full production. The legalization of alcohol also brought about a new era of, regulation, with the federal government imposing strict controls on production, distribution, and the sales. And it was just like a far cry from the wild, unregulated days of Prohibition. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Prohibition is the way it shaped American culture. The era gave rise to a new kind of American folklore, with stories of moonshiners, bootleggers, speakeasies becoming an integral part of kind of our national history. It also had a profound impact on the American law enforcement, with the establishment of federal agencies like the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which continues to regulate the alcohol industry today. Although abolishing Prohibition was proposed in February, it took most of the year to reach a legal majority to pass into law, as Congress let each state cast their vote. Some states never did, and those who voted against the 21st Amendment were allowed to maintain Prohibition, leading to origins of today's, what we call like dry counties, and there are still counties that are dry, and you can't buy liquor there. The shift back to legal regulated alcohol, it also marked a huge change in the flow of profits away from the hands of gangsters and black marketers, and back towards the actual distillers and brewers and the merchants and communities across the depression-stricken U.S. Prohibition lasted a little more than 13 years. During that time, there were states that didn't feel the need to enforce the laws within their borders. For example, like Maryland never enacted and really enforced the code. Other states, however, decided to continue the ban on alcohol even after Prohibition's repeal. Oklahoma stayed dry until 1959, and no alcohol was allowed in Mississippi until 1966. Even today, 10 states have counties where alcohol sales are still completely prohibited. And there you have it, my friends. That brings us to the end of the episode. We've explored the rise of moonshining during Prohibition, reviewed some whiskeys that pay tribute to that era, and told some stories of some of the most infamous figures in the trade. Whether you're sipping on a fine whiskey or just enjoying a cold beer, remember that you are partaking in a tradition with deep, rebellious roots. Thank you so much for joining me. Send me a message and let me know what you think about the episode. Would love any feedback as I kind of fine-tune what this podcast will be. Be sure to give the show a rating or review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your shows. Until next time, keep the spirit alive, and guys, I will talk to you soon.